My name is Rabbi Mordechai Lightstone, and my wife Chana, who's actually joining this class, which is great. We together we run Tech Tribe, which is an organization part of Chabad Professionals that creates events and experiences for Jews in tech and digital media. And as part of that, we've been privileged to be able to do this series of talks on the intersection between Judaism and tech and all kinds of fascinating things like that. Um, and therefore, I'd like to begin today's talk about digital recording and privacy in Jewish law. So, by means of introduction, it's worth noting that um, this is not a comprehensive talk. There are a lot of different factors that come in to the limits of digital recording, how and when and where it applies, especially when it comes to giving that data and information over to the government, which is the main thrust of today's conversation. So this is just to bring up some of the various factors that play into the kind of Talmudic and post-Talmudic discourse around these ideas, and to begin to kind of give food for thought about how the Torah, how Jewish law views the limits of information, what can and cannot be shared. And the final thing is, before we go to the first piece of text, is that obviously questions are great. We'll save all the questions for the end, and then we can take it from there. So by means of introduction, there is a teaching in Pirkei Avot, which is a collection of ethical teachings from the rabbis, that reads, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi would say, contemplate three things and you will not come to the hands of transgression. Know what is above you, a seeing eye, a listening ear, and all your deeds being inscribed in a book. And in general, I view this particular teaching as particularly important for anyone who spends a lot of time online, because everything we put on the internet lasts forever. But more so, in general, we are always being surveilled. There's always this surveillance from a higher source, but that is, so to speak, a unique relationship between us and the Creator, and our own personal conduct and the personal things that we do in the world are not necessarily supposed to be privy to anyone else. Obviously, God is seeing everything, but everyone else does not get access to that. So, when it comes to the boundaries of privacy in Jewish law, it's important to note that in Jewish law, there's very little discussion of rights. Rights, as a concept, the way they exist in America and Western law, really don't fall into the world of halacha and to Jewish law. Instead, Judaism tends to focus on responsibilities, meaning as opposed to the inalienable right that I have to certain things, Judaism says that I have an existential obligation to do or not do certain things unto others. Practically speaking, that may mean the results are the same, but it's obviously a slightly different approach. So therefore, it's less about the right to privacy and more about the obligation of the other person not to interfere, not to eavesdrop, not to overhear, or for me not to convey that information. So all this discussion really is found in a Talmudic passage from Yoma, which is the tractate which speaks about Yom Kippur primarily. But in that discussion, it analyzes the first verse of Leviticus. So it says, the verse says, and he called unto Moses, he being God here, and the Lord spoke unto him from within the tent of meeting, saying, and this is a verse. And so if you notice under there, it's he called, and the Lord spoke, saying. So there's three different forms of communication going on over here. God speaking to Moses, telling Moses to say. So Rabbi Masya said in the name of Rabbi Musia the Great, from where is it derived with regard to one who tells another some matter? It is incumbent upon the later not to say it to others until the former explicitly says to him, go into others, as it is stated, and the Lord spoke to him from within the tent of meeting, saying, lemor is the Hebrew word to say. So the Talmud is saying that God is telling Moses, I'm telling you something. And then after that, he tells Moses to tell the children of Israel, tell the Jewish people, because he's now giving explicit permission for it to be said. The word lemor, to say in Hebrew, can be read, and this is how Rashi explains it. Lemor can be read as a contraction of the words loy emor, meaning do not say, when it's been given permission before transmitting information. Meaning that if I tell something to someone else, Judaism assumes that that person is not allowed to go ahead and tell it to other people unless they get explicit information. So therefore, we're seeing from this verse that even when it comes to Moses' conversation with God, and God is speaking to Moses, God is telling him, Loy Emar, this is, the generally speaking, a conversation is private between us, unless he then goes ahead and explicitly says that their permission is now given to convey that conversation to others. And I see some people are joining, which is great. And if anything's unclear, we can catch up on that at the end and clarify, but it should all flow into place since we just really started. So that comes to the general idea that any conversation I have is really supposed to be and understood to be between me and the person I have it with, and that information shouldn't be conveyed to others. Now, what happens about someone being able to oversee what I do? And from after that, we're going to get into being able to overhear what I do. So, Maimonides, when speaking about the rules of neighbors, so it's important to remember that in Talmudic times, the way houses were shaped, you would have a courtyard, a common courtyard shared by a number of homes, and then around the common courtyard, you have private dwellings. So the courtyard was a semi-private space. It was only available to the neighbors who were around this courtyard to share, and each person would then be able to do whatever they wanted their uh, in their home privately. The courtyard was semi-private, and the open street was considered a full-on public domain. So the question is, in the courtyard, sometimes they'd put up various walls around the courtyard space so that my little section of the courtyard remains private to me, so I can go outside in my pajamas and not have to worry about being seen by others, for example, and be able to use it maybe to do my exercises and stretches. I don't want to be overseen, so therefore they would sometimes divide up the courtyard with walls to give each person some private space. So Maimonides says, what happens when we're talking about this courtyard? With regard to a courtyard owned in partnership that is large enough to divide, or one that was divided by consent, even though it is not large enough to divide, each of the partners may compel the other to join in the building of a wall in the middle of the courtyard, so that one will not see the other when using the courtyard. The rationale is that damage caused by an invasion of privacy, in Hebrew this is called hezek re'iyah, we're going to use this term a number of times, is considered to be damage. So Maimonides is stating a general rule over here that damage doesn't just mean physical damage, doesn't just mean breaking somebody's property or physically harming them. Seeing someone else also causes a form of damage. Various commentators kind of explain how does seeing someone else create damage. One is that it takes away from their ability to freely use the space however they want. Another one is that it causes physical damage. People don't like being seen. People get upset by it. It may cause the evil eye. Whatever it is. There are various discussions around how seeing someone else is damage. But it is an accepted rule in Talmudic law and in Jewish law that someone invading your privacy by looking at you is causing a form of damage, and therefore someone can compel someone else. Two partners who want to divide up this courtyard can compel other people to create a division where one person gets one side, the other person gets the other side, the wall breaks, they both have to pay to fix the wall because I want to be able to use my courtyard privately the way I want to and not be seen. Just a little bit further in terms of how much of a stress Jewish law puts on the right not to be seen. So in the Code of Jewish Law is written by Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, was the founder of the Chabad movement, writes in the laws of monetary damage. Some say that a person must be careful not to stand in front of the entrance to a friend's house or courtyard, lest he accidentally glimpse inside and see what he's privately engaged in. Rather, while outside, he should turn his head while in front of the entrance, so that his friend not suspect he is peeping by catching him glancing in surreptitiously without any just cause. So that if I'm standing, I'm picking up a cup of sugar from my neighbor, instead of kind of looking into the doorway from the outside, even though it's my friend, even though they've opened the door to me, whatever it is, I should kind of look askance or not stare directly in the house. And he adds, even those people on public property are not allowed to stand and gaze at others, or they should only look with brief glances necessary for walking, which are unavoidable. One must be modest in his affairs regarding which a stray glance could disturb him. So that when we go about, obviously, listen, you have to look where you're going. You should walk with your eyes closed. You could see the world around you. But to stand and gape at other people and stare at them, things like that, even if it's in a public space, is considered, at least on a kind of an ethical level, to be a breach of this idea. This does not fall under the rules of damages. Meaning, if somebody's standing at the street and looking at you, obviously, you can't tell you can't find them, or compel them to stop or anything like that. But in terms of our own conduct, it's informative that someone else's privacy is considered that sacred, so to speak, within a Jewish sense. So all that goes to show us merely that whatever is that being seen by others is something that's considered a form of damage and therefore may not be done. What about hearing other people? So when it comes to hearing other people, there is a debate about how it would take place. Again, in this scenario of a shared courtyard where we want to build a wall, and can the other person be forced to build it? So the case that Maimonides brought beforehand, but the question is, does that only apply to hezek re'iyah of seeing the other person, or does it also caused by hezek shmiya of overhearing? So one may follow whatever the local custom is to remove hezek re'iyah in a shared courtyard. Sorry, this piece over here is from Rabbi Menachem Meiri, who was a French medieval commentator on the Talmud. So one may follow whatever the local custom is to remove hezek re'iyah in a shared courtyard, even if it's a very thin partition. We do not worry about being overheard, hezek shmiya, since the average person is careful with how they speak in that environment. So the Meiri says that, say you want to build a wall in this shared courtyard, you can make it out of reeds, you can make it out of a paper partition, you can put up a curtain. We worry about hezek re'iyah, about someone having the right to be overseen, being seen in this semi-private space. But we don't worry about hezek shmiya, about someone overhearing what's going on in this private space. Since most people know that if they're in that kind of their backyard, if they shout, they're going to be overheard. If they're in this shared courtyard space, they have the ability to whisper and be quiet if they don't want to be heard. And therefore, we don't compel the building of a wall that would somehow block sound as well as sight. So that's the Meiri. If we look at the Meiri and think about what he's saying, though, even though he's saying in the case of the shared courtyard, we're not worried about being overheard because most people know that they can modulate the tones of their voice, and therefore it's not necessarily we don't have to prevent them from being overheard. It still establishes that there are other theoretical cases, according to the Meiri, according to this commentator, that being overheard could be considered damage. The second opinion, however, we'll see that feels that there's no such thing as being overheard, and that overhearing someone somehow recording or being able to hear what someone else says is not considered an invasion of privacy and a form of damage. So nevertheless, this is from Rabbi Eliyahu Mizrahi, who was the chief rabbi of Constantinople in the Ottoman Empire. Nevertheless, when it comes to building a wall of reeds, it's clear that this is enough, and one neighbor cannot compel the other to build with stones, even if construction in that area is normally done with stone. And one may not complain about being overheard, since we do not find the concept of hezek shmiya, of being overheard, discussed anywhere in the Talmud. And there's no reason to differentiate this matter between courtyards and home. So according to the Eliyahu Mizrahi, according to this opinion, no, being overheard, the right to keep your conversations quiet, is not considered any form of damage discussed in the Talmud, and therefore he feels it doesn't exist. And therefore, if you're rebuilding this wall, the shared wall, be it between your houses, between in a common shared courtyard area, you can build out of whatever material blocks being overseen, but does not block being overheard. And on a slightly deeper level, the reason behind this debate can perhaps be understood to hinge on how we understand what hezek re'iyah, what the damage of being overseen is. Is it a form of financial loss or spiritual loss or some sort of an actual damage? And if it's an actual damage, then we only have the damage the Talmud set out to being considered damage that we have to worry about. Anything else is not considered damage. That would be the opinion of the Mizrahi. According to the understanding that hezek re'iyah, being overseen, is more about the limitations it puts on my ability to freely use the space however I want, since it prevents me from using the space however I want, at that point in time, perhaps being overheard in certain scenarios would also be considered a constraint put on me, and it would be considered damage as well. It's a little slightly, deeper reading of this debate. But in any event, we see over here that there are two opinions: if being overheard by other people is considered a form of damage, and therefore something that cannot be done, or if it's not considered a form of damage. And all this, as we're going to get to right now, feeds into the question of modern recording and kind of the crux of the issue at hand. So, in principle, in principle, we should consider hezek shmiya and hezek re'iyah to be the same. This is from an answer written in 1992, I believe, by Rabbi Shlomo who is a current rabbi in Israel. So really, we should consider being overseen, being overheard. Really, they're the same thing. Why do we see that when it comes to the semi-private courtyard, then that point in time, we're worried about being overseen, but we're not being overheard? It's only that most people are careful when they speak in the semi-private spaces. From here, it's clear that by means of modern hidden recording device, where being careful isn't a possibility, we should consider Hezek like Hezek Shmiya, that we should always, that when it comes to our current ability to record somebody, even in a private space at that point in time, that is considered full on Hezek a real damage by being overseen by someone else. And therefore, even if you're only putting an audio recording device or you're listening to a cell phone call or somehow picking up on that information, that would be considered a form of damage because it's not something that a person can modulate. When I'm walking down the street, I know I speak at one level. If I want to speak quietly to someone, I can whisper to them. If we're in a courtyard, so I can modulate it more. If I'm at home, I consider myself to be more safe, right? Because traditionally speaking, in our communication, we knew depending on the space, we had the safety of being overheard or not being overheard, depending on where we're at, and we had the ability to move to a more quiet space if we wanted to be able to make sure that it was private. Therefore, there were times when Hezek Shmiya, being overheard by someone, wasn't considered a real damage because you could just speak quietly somewhere else. But when it comes to our modern communications and the recording of them, where that can be done anywhere and in any way, and even a conversation a person would think theoretically would be private, it's a private phone call. I'm calling one person to another, I'm inside my house, they're inside their house, no one can overhear, there's no speakerphone. Since it's not possible to modulate and prevent, by some other means, normal means, within the normal use of these things, from being recorded. So therefore, to actively go out and record it is considered a damage, and therefore one would have to get full permission to be able, from the person speaking, to share that recording with others. Not a slide in here, but there's a question asked, but to Rabbi Menashe HaKatan is another modern day rabbinic figure. Am I allowed to record a class? I'm listening to a lecture. Can I record the lecture on a tape or an MP3 player, whatever it is, record it privately, and then just use it later on to listen to myself to review my notes? And he said, no, you're not. Why? Because when it comes to taking notes, true, you're able to take notes from a lecture. But if I take notes from a lecture, the wording is not precise. It's my own wording, and that's considered standard. But if I'm recording a lecture to listen to it later, it may be the person speaking, had he realized or she realized that they're being recorded, they would have worded it differently, would have phrased it differently, and therefore to record a lecture or class without permission is also not allowed. In any event, we see that modern day, and this is basically universally understood to be so, that in a modern scenario, the ability to record someone, not just visually, but even just the audio, visual is much more clear from the Talmudic sense, but in a modern scenario, recording someone visibly or orally to be able to record it being, heard, either way, it's considered a form of damage and therefore may not be done. We're going to get to some caveats in a moment. Sympathy, sorry. All right. So a different approach. There's another issue at hand when it comes to digital surveillance and recording information about other people. And this is from the famous Cherem of Rabbeinu Gershom. Rabbeinu Gershom was one of the preeminent Ashkenazi European rabbinic figures. He lived from 960 to 1040 CE in the Common Era. And many of his decrees are really foundational in terms of shaping the Jewish world today in Jewish law. And he created a synod, he gathered a bunch of rabbis together, and they passed a bunch of decrees. Most famously, the most famous decree that they made was that was banning polygamy amongst at least Ashkenazi Jews. Today, even Sephardic Jews accept that for various reasons. But that's his most famous thing. But another famous thing is that when it comes to divorces, a person can't divorce a woman against her will. He can't just give her a get, give her a divorce document, and send her on her way. She has to be a willing participant. But in our case, it's that one may not read the letter sent from one person to another without the sender's knowledge and permission. So that when you send a letter, it's considered private, and a person is not allowed to read it without permission from the one sending it. So you see over here that when it comes to communication, so letters, email, text, all these things, it's not permitted to read it without the permission from the one who sent it. And this was a decree he made, and is still very much in effect. So why is it that he made this decree that you're not allowed to read a letter from someone else being sent, if I have communications with someone else, that written communication cannot be read. So besides all the discussion of being overseen and being overheard that we had previously, there's another factor at play. This factor is in the writings of Rabbi Chaim Palaji, who was a famous rabbi in the Ottoman Empire in Smyrna, in Izmir, and he writes, "It would seem that the entire reason for Rabbeinu Gershom's prohibition is in keeping with the principle of love your fellow as yourself, and what is hateful to you, do not do to others." These are two different famous sayings. V'ahavta l'reacha kamecha is a saying in the Bible in Leviticus, and what is hateful to you, don't do to others is something that Hillel famously said, that essentially we have an obligation to show love and respect to other people. And therefore, if I send a letter to someone else, it's against this principle of having that love and respect for other people. And I would not want my private communications read. And therefore, I am prohibited from reading someone else's letters. But what happens if my letter has, potential damage? In this case, Rabbi Chaim Palaji is actually speaking about a case where a Jewish merchant feels that one of his customers is somehow plotting against him and going to be able to surreptitiously go around him and cause financial loss to him. And he has a letter from that person that's supposed to be delivered. Can he pick up the letter to see if it's going to cause damage to him? This is the case that Chaim Palaji is speaking about. So, generally speaking, it's about the love and respect that you have for another person, not to invade their privacy and read the letter. But if in this case, since this letter is actually going to cause real financial harm and loss based on the discussion over there, but also in general, at that point in time, nevertheless, if there's clear signs of physical, financial, spiritual harm, it is permissible to read the letter at that point in time. And this opens up a much broader discussion that, generally speaking, when it comes to any form of communication we have, phone calls, video chat, text, email, whatever it is, there are multiple reasons why they should not be seen. They shouldn't be seen because of hezekir iya and shmiya, because of the real damage that's caused by the surveillance, by being overseen and being overheard. And as well, this prohibition on reading the mail of other people, which is under the principle of I would not want that done to me, so therefore I'm not allowed to do it to anyone else. This would apply to governments as well. But if there's going to be damage, at that point in time, it's permissible to see it. Now, the question is, what constitutes damage? What constitutes loss and harm? And the reality is that, it's a complex topic, both when it comes to, with governments today, how far do we go when it comes to allowing the government to prevent harm to people, to really push it? And then I'm not going to say there's, total clarity in every case when it comes to Jewish law as well, but I'm going to give a particular case of when it's okay to break this trust of privacy with other, in order to be able to prevent someone else from being harmed. So this particular case was given by, it was asked of the Tzitz Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg was a rabbi who famously answered a number of different medical questions. His synagogue was right next to, I believe, the Shaare Zedek hospital in Jerusalem, and therefore a lot of doctors would pray there. They would ask him his questions, and he ended up publishing a number of books with detailed conversations about medical ethics and things like that. So this is one of those questions. He says, question, he was asked, you ask if a doctor finds a patient who has a medical condition that puts others at risk. For example, the patient's vision is going, creating a situation where a car accident is likely, and the patient refuses to cease driving. Are you permitted to notify the authorities? So someone is, their vision is going, they can no longer see the way to be, they're going blind or whatever it is, and somehow now the doctor is worried after seeing this patient is no longer fit to drive, but the patient refuses to stop driving, absolutely refuses in a very clear way, and insists on continuing driving, and therefore is posing a real danger to others. So his answer is the doctor is definitely obligated to inform the necessary authorities about the patient, even if the patient asks the doctor to keep it a secret, since otherwise the matter could possibly come to endanger others, and if the doctor refuses to intercede, then he violates the commandment, do not stand idly by the blood of your fellow. The doctor should not worry about possible financial loss to the patient, since nothing is more important than pikuach nefesh. The actual case was actually a case of a bus driver who was no longer able to see properly and kept on driving. And therefore he said it doesn't matter, yes, by reporting this patient to the authorities, at that point in time, the doctor is going to cause him to lose his job as a bus driver, and that has real implications on his own, on the patient's financial well-being. But because there's a greater need to not allow others to be harmed, it's considered pikuach nefesh, saving a life. Therefore, even if there's this normal trust between a doctor and patient, between one form of communication, and this applies to other forms of communication as well. This was a conversation held in private. The patient, showed the doctor in private that he was losing his ability to see. Nevertheless, the doctor has to go ahead and report it because there's real harm to other people. And it has to be real harm, at least in the doctor's expert estimation. And therefore, this is just one example out of many that theoretically speaking, if somebody comes across a certain form of communication or information or things like that, that would theoretically be able to cause damage to other people at that point in time, the expectations of privacy, of hezek re'iyah and hezek shmiya, not being overseen, not being overheard, not having your letters read, would no longer apply and would be acceptable to take that information and convey it to others. So this is just one example of an exception, but overall, it's obviously a bit more complex when it comes to it. So, out of all this discussion, and then we could open up to conversation and questions. There's a life lesson for us to learn as well. This is from a talk that the Lubavitcher Rebbe gave Hanukkah 1991, when the menorah lighting was broadcast on satellite TV, linking up a number of different communities around the world. And so the Rebbe spoke about the fact that you have this satellite broadcast. Satellites are created, was Cold War technology was used to be able to help, create, for military purposes and things like that. There's a real lesson to be learned from how satellites surveying and filming and conveying this information has for our own lives. So seemingly, heaven and earth are two disparate entities. How can it truthfully be claimed that at their core they are truly one? How is there oneness behind the universe? How is there oneness between the physical and the spiritual, between the mundane and the godly? How is there a oneness felt there? So, but taking a lesson from the satellite hookup itself, one can see the underlying unity in creation. In this case, Jews on opposite sides of the world, in Moscow, New York, Calcutta, Japan, Israel, Australia, are able to connect to each other, and that using this modern technology, which was created for surveillance and targeting, things like that, one, you can not just send a message or talk, but bring tangible relief to their most basic physical needs. In this case, the Rebbe was specifically referring to how using this technology, one could harness it and be able to cause actual relief for someone else. For example, you could transfer funds. So if somebody's needy, somebody's hungry on the other side of the world, traditionally, you would say the person's on the other side of the world. How can I help them? How can I do anything for them? Now you can not only talk to them and see them and communicate with them, but you're able to harness this spy technology, traditionally, to actually be able to transfer funds, to be able to send bank deposits to each other, to be able to today launch a GoFundMe or something to help fund someone else's needs. And we can see that using these different technologies that were traditionally used for surveillance and spying can actually be used today for real physical good for other people. And with that, we'll conclude. Our organization, again, is Tech Tribe. You could follow me on Twitter and all the other social networks, Instagram, Snap, TikTok, whatever, Facebook, at Matal, and My Tech Tribe is the handle for us on all those platforms as well. And we have a weekly email, mytechtribe.org/dispatch, which is very exciting. I would love for you guys to be able to check out as well.